Welcome to show 53 of the Shortlist, where I am in the world, which is in Ireland, in the Northern Hemisphere. It's summertime, and with June arriving yesterday, I think, as it was, so came summer. So welcome everybody to our summer show. The first of, it's really, June is the summer in Ireland. It's Wimbledon month. It's when the kids break up from school. It's when the sun maybe shines for a couple of days in Ireland, as it has done the last few whiles. And hopefully everyone's in a bit of a better mood. Welcome today. We're going to be talking about leveraging the strengths of a multi-generational workforce. We got a fantastic guest who's going to be chatting with us about her insights in the multi-generational workforce. And we'd love to hear your comments and thoughts. If you're listening live, don't forget this is a live show broadcast each week on Wednesday at 4 p.m. UK Irish time on LinkedIn and YouTube. And if you're joining us live, please do join in. We always love hearing your comments, questions for our guests, and whatever you want to put into the chat on LinkedIn or YouTube, we'll pick them up live. If you're not, don't forget that we are a podcast that is available on Spotify and Apple, and we are up past our 50th show, and there's a great back catalogue of fantastic shows and interviews on the topics of talent over the last year or so. And you can find out more about the show, our upcoming shows, our previous shows, watch the videos, get the links at socialtalent.com/the shortlist. But on to today's show. So the multi-generational workforce. So we're living longer. Yay, isn't it great? But that typically often means that we're working longer. And we're also starting earlier as more and more individuals choose not to necessarily go down the university route. So at both ends of the workforce spectrum, we're seeing it stretch. There's up to 5 generations working in the workplace today, from the traditionalists to the Gen Z. And it's often an overlooked area of diversity, equity, inclusion, but one that is becoming more and more important to large organizations and small organizations alike across the world. And whilst obviously each particular cohort typically has its own unique strengths, it can be a difficult task to try to understand how you can leverage a multi-generational team for success. So our guest today, I'm delighted to have on the show, is Dr. Mary Collins. And Mary's a chartered psychologist and professional executive coach who is a leading expert in the field of engaging this multi-generational workforce. And on this episode, Mary's going to be sharing with us advice on how to get the best from each generation, and also we're going to delve into management strategies, looking at how both empathy and emotional intelligence play vital roles in supporting and cultivating success. And finally, she'll give us some insights into the impact the pandemic has had on all of this, but through a uniquely generational lens. And if that wasn't good enough, Mary just recently released a new book called Recruiting Talented People, which we'll dig into and ask her about later on, which is a practical guide for small to medium-sized businesses on the recruitment life cycle, offering tips and insights from everything from establishing employer brands, interview processes, right through to induction. And we just discovered, Mary, it's available on Amazon, and it falsely claims you're writing a whole bunch of other books that weren't yours, Mary. So tell us about these false claims, Mary. What's going on? And welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Johnny. And it's really lovely to be here. And hello to everybody listening in now, and also to the podcast. Really, really delighted to have this opportunity. And thanks for the plug about the book. It's literally hot off the press, and delighted to hear it is on Amazon, as verified by Johnny 5 minutes ago. So it's been a real labour of love for the last 3 years, and I'm delighted it's out. And I've had the great honour and pleasure of working with thought leaders, including the very Johnny Campbell, who have contributed to the book. And it really is aimed at small and medium businesses who don't have that sort of big recruitment machine behind them, and how they can manage each stage of the recruitment cycle, and not just be reactive to their recruitment needs.
And it must be 3-4 years since we had our first cup of tea and conversation about this topic back in the Bewley's Cafe on Grafton Street, Mary. But I want to ask you about the multi-generational aspect, because on the same day, you blew me away with insights around your observations at the time around what was Generation Z, which was only beginning to come into the workforce, could have been 5 years ago even, and challenges around resilience and other topics. What has made you passionate about this topic around multi-generational workforces, and why has that become a thing for you over the last few years?
Yeah, well, I'm just so delighted you picked this topic, social talented, because I do feel it's the neglected child of diversity and inclusion. You know, we've such a strong emphasis on gender, race, disability, but we don't tend to focus on age, on life stage so much. So I'll take you back, Johnny, to when I was head of talent and leadership development in Deloitte. And at the time, 80% of the firm were under 30. So it was a really exciting time, very young, dynamic, ambitious workforce. And I was doing a lot of psychometric profiling. And I started to notice some really interesting trends that a lot of the young grads coming in, when I looked at their career values using Edgar Schein's career anchors tool, some viewers may be familiar with that. Essentially, it's looking at what is most important to you in a career. And I started seeing some really interesting trends. So the one anchor that kept reoccurring as the top anchor was pure challenge. And we know that people who have this as a career value, they want complex problems, lots of responsibility, lots of variety in their roles. And the second anchor that came up on a consistent basis was work-life balance. Now, I think you'll agree they're not always comfortable bedfellows. You want all this
No?
responsibility and you want work-life balance. So I said, I want to get under the bonnet of this. I want to just explore this. And under the bonnet I got, and I spent the next 4.5 years doing my doctoral thesis looking at the younger generations in the workplace and how we can really engage and motivate and get the best from the younger generations. And I looked at engineers, lawyers, and accountants as part of that study. But really, there was very little difference between the professions. There was a lot of consistent messages coming through.
There's a lot being talked about out there in the press and articles. It's increasingly becoming more focused. I think you're right about it is the forgotten child, and that's
Yeah.
not to take away from the importance of the other areas of diversity, but
Yeah.
it's and it has a lot of intersectionality as well around those other area diverses. We've noticed an increase in the amount of talk about it online. And Mary, surprise, surprise, for the shortlist, we found some news articles for us to dive into. Niall, over to you for the news. The first one I wanted to look at and get your thoughts were a piece that was published in Forbes last month on 5 ways to lead the multi-generational workplace. I wonder if you could maybe take us through, if you can, what you got from this article, maybe a summary of those 5 ways, and what your thoughts were on Benjamin Laker's, who's the writer here, his kind of opinion on this area.
Yeah, sure, Johnny. And I thought this was a really interesting article. I also thought it can be a little bit simplistic. So the big health warning I always start with when I talk about this is how important it is not to stereotype and not to assign or assume that if someone is of a particular generation. So, for example, one of the most common ones I come across in my work is, someone in their 20s is really good with technology. We have a 25-year-old on the team, give them all the tech stuff. And then you have a 25-year-old going, I don't know how to open Excel, or, making these assumptions all the time. So again, I think, it's important that we don't simplify this topic too much. And there's a lot of pop psychology out there around it as well. So just to say that. So I thought this article highlighted the benefits of a multi-generational workforce. And we know that gender and age diverse teams, the multifaceted approach you mentioned, Johnny, are 80% more effective at making better decisions. So gender alone, teams who have gender diversity are 73% more effective at making better decisions. So I think that's quite an interesting fact. The article also talked about the importance of collaboration between the generations and how that leads to innovation and high performance. And it is also, if you have a multi-generational workforce, it should be reflective of your market. In most cases, most of us are working in multi-generational consumer markets as well. So the big message for me around how to lead multi-generational teams from this article was really using emotionally intelligent leadership. Leaders who are aware, who can flex and adapt their style, and really show empathy to people at all life stages.
Yeah, it's kind of something that I think is not just applicable to the multi-generational
Yeah.
workforce, if you'd agree. This is emerging as a theme across the board, particularly as we've had such a focus on leadership and what good leadership looks like in the last year, Mary, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's you have to be very aware of who is in your team, what's happening in their lives, really take an interest. But this points to understanding what are the different strengths of each member of the team and making sure that you are leveraging all the individual strengths to make the team better as a whole.
Yeah.
I didn't really offer much practical advice as to how to do that. Very short 5 bullet points, which is kind of a bit high level for me.
Yeah.
But I think there's
Yeah.
a lot of, you take each of those points and you go further. There's a lot of good research, and there are great
Yeah.
instructional kind of courses and programs you can go on that teach you each aspect of that.
Yeah.
Having psychological safety in the team, being open to feedback, trying to get everyone to participate. A challenge sometimes on Zoom calls these days, where we're on Zoom meetings, and understanding the difference between a facilitator and a leader on a call and these different things. I
Yeah.
guess it's probably not just multi-generational really that the advice would apply to. It's kind of like, how do you get the best from just people? Would you agree?
Absolutely, Johnny. It really was. It was quite generic, and you find a lot of research or a lot of articles in this field can be a bit generic. What I did think was interesting, though, was the UN data around ageism and how
Mm.
ageism tends to be polarized towards older workers and younger workers. And just to mention a really interesting study I came across. Anglica Ruskin University in London, where they did a longitudinal study where they had the CV of a 50-year-old and a 28-year-old. So with very similar skills and attributes. And they found that the 50-year-old was 4.2 times less likely to get called to interview. 4.2 times less likely. And a 50-year-old who was a female, was 5.3 times less likely. So double whammy if you're older and you're a woman. So I think these are the type of things we need to tackle. And we hear a lot about, younger workers and having to adapt our style. I'm very interested in the whole area of older workers. And I think there's a huge opportunity, particularly with baby boomers in our workplaces, that have so much wisdom to offer. Dorothy Leonard in Harvard talks about deep smarts, which are as close as you can get to wisdom. Like boomers have, this rich experience and wisdom to share. And we know from the research on boomers, they want to give back, they want to mentor, they want to really be part of the organization.
That's funny because you mentioned the attitudes to ageism, and my career started in recruiting back in my early 20s. I was 20 when I started recruiting, and it shames me to admit this, but it's important to admit it. When I was a recruiter, and I recruited accountants, I know the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Ireland are the publishers of your latest book.
Yeah.
I recruited qualified accountants for large organizations, and I would run my search in my database, and we had a filter of age, and I would sort by age, and above 35, I'd remove them. And for financial controller roles or whatever they were, I was like, well, they're too old to be doing this job.
Yeah.
And I couldn't tell you why I had that opinion. I just felt from a 20 or 21-year-old's perspective that surely they should be doing something else at that point in their career or whatever it might have been.
Yeah.
And whilst I'd love to think that doesn't happen anymore, I do fear it does. And the data you shared there, I think,
Yeah.
probably proves out that this stuff still happens. We still have this age bias. And I know that a lot of people I've spoken to, again, I'm mid-career, mid-40s, mid-career, and therefore I get to speak to folks on both sides of where I am. I talk to a lot of people who perhaps are later in their career, and they've shared with me the challenges of things like LinkedIn, where you don't want to reveal your entire career because people are going to estimate your age.
Mm.
They're worried about the photo you put up there because that will give an indication to your age. This is a thing, when you're looking for a job, that if you are in that older generation and you have experienced this in your career, and most of us have,
Yeah.
you're going to be very conscious of it. And arguably, the online tools don't work in your favor when they're showing photographs, encouraging you to put your full career history, give dates for the university that you went to, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what's your kind of view on what recruiters can do, or individuals, hiring managers can do to try and mitigate that or to reduce that?
Yeah, and it's Thank you for being so honest, Johnny. I'm sure you don't think 35 is old now, but
Heck
20 year
no.
old. um, it comes back really to the whole inclusive piece and what's the business case, what does that, the having the wisdom and the experience of older workers in the workplace. Really interesting research from Ashridge, a report called Don't Leave Baby Boomers in the Corner, like a play on Dirty Dancing. And when they surveyed HR leaders, what are your views on baby boomers? It was actually quite negative. It was like, oh, cruising towards retirement, lacking innovation, these types of comments. And then they interviewed the boomers themselves, and it was really quite different. There was comments like, I've never felt more comfortable in my own skin. I'm feeling really creative. I want to give back. I want to mentor. And all that stuff I had going on, the childcare and the elder care issues in my 30s and 40s, I don't have that anymore. So I have a lot more time and energy to give to my career. So for me, this is around really seeing the benefits that having the multi-generational mix can bring to your organization. And just to add as well, Johnny, I did hear from last month there's a technology company which will remain nameless, have their European head office in Ireland, which doesn't really discount many, and
That's most of them.
most of them. And I was quite shocked when I heard this, that they were looking for executive coaches to bring in, but they were only looking for coaches under 30 years of age.
Seriously.
Yeah. And I just thought, wow, you're missing out on a whole cohort there. Mm.
Well, I'll counter that with another technology story. And I'll name them because I think it's a really positive thing. A good friend of mine who is in his late 50s recently joined Google in a senior leadership role. And he was kind of surprised he got the role because he's from a very traditional industry. He'd been 20 odd years in the same company. And, he's older. And I asked him about it. I said, he brought it up. I said, that's fantastic. What's going on? He said, actually, it's something that he observed has been a thing Google have been doing for the last 4 or 5 years in recognition of the fact that they will be better as a company, have more innovation, better decision making if they have both a mix of more older individuals because they were skewed very young for several decades. But also that they had other industries coming in. And again, it points to this diversity piece around diversity of thought drives better innovation, drives better decision making. And to your point, the research around when you add multi-sectional diversity into teams, older individuals from different minorities, put that all together in a group, all of a sudden you just have more voices that have different backgrounds, which cannot be a bad thing, And I think that's what large organizations are waking up to. I have no doubt that the big organizations that do it aren't doing it at the goodness of their heart, Mary. There's a huge amount of evidence that says you have better decisions. You will be better off having more voices. And it makes sense, right? You go back to the Beatles 1,000 hours type experience. The more times you've done something, the better you are at it. And by nature, age is one of those proxies for experience. It's not always a good one, don't get me wrong, but chances are if you're working with teams, if you're managing longer than somebody else, there's a higher chance you've got just more experience that you can pass on. It just makes sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely, Johnny. And also, we need mentors in organizations. Really interesting fact from Deloitte do great millennial studies, that those millennials intending to stay more than 5 years in their organizations were twice as likely to have a mentor. So if they said they were intending to stay more than 5 years, they were twice as likely to have a mentor. And we know the best mentors are going to be, for millennials, the best mentors are baby boomers. So we need more of them.
And speaking of Deloitte, your former employer as well,
Yes.
I'm going to go to our second news article because this was a pretty long one and it was again published a couple of months ago. And it's entitled Wrong Numbers, and it comes from Deloitte Insights, Why a Focus on Age Can Mislead Workforce Development. And this, I found, there's actually a huge amount to unpack in this one, Mary.
Yeah.
And this was it was, in summary, kind of pointing to the danger of having that, here are the 5 generations or 4 generations, and here's how they think and what they do. And I'll get to the COVID element, which I thought was fascinating. It came up later in the article. But you know, what is your take on this in terms of the initial, data and perspective shared by this Deloitte research around the dangers of having this generational approach to how we look at the workforce?
Yes, and I think it is valid to have that challenge. There's a lot of challenge in the academic literature as well, and some people prefer to talk about life stage, which I think is just a different perspective on it, looking at different life stages. I think what is important, Johnny, is that we acknowledge the universal human needs. So, we all have a need to be respected, recognized, appreciated. And even if we look at, self-determination theory in psychology, that need for autonomy, for competence and relatedness. So there are sort of universal needs to be motivated in a workplace. And I think that transcends the generational stuff.
Agreed.
But what I would say is we can, there are certain fundamental factors that have influenced different cohorts in the workplace. Two of the biggest drivers in recent times have been technology. So we have the digital natives on one side and then the digital immigrants. And if I may be so bold, Johnny, I was trying to figure out how old Johnny was to ask him had he been called for his vaccination, because we're doing it by like age in Ireland every day.
See
So
what
I
you did
think
there, Mary. See what you did there now.
so I think we're a similar vintage. We're in the 40s bracket, shall we say.
Good
So
enough.
you will remember, Johnny, the days before mobile phones, before the internet. I think we're in a really unique position. Our generation, Generation X, we have that unique perspective of remembering life before all of the distraction, and and then we have the digital natives who have been brought up in this world. And when we see 2-year-olds swiping iPads, it's a different paradigm. It is the world they are growing up in. So I think that is one of the fundamental drivers of generational difference is technology. And the other one is parenting styles.
Mm-hmm.
When you consider, how a 24-year-old has been brought up versus a 44-year-old, on average, they're going to be very different experiences.
And I've a theory on that in terms of the child raising things, each generation tries to do the opposite of what their parents did. So every second generation, it's the same because it's like, all right. But it's
Yeah.
I saw in the numbers, because I think there is a valid argument to behaviors based on when you grow up, what your influences were, what was happening in the world at the time, 100%, the media you were exposed to, etc. I was working a couple of years ago, around the time of the Rugby World Cup, with some customers out in Japan. And what was happening there, and has continued over the last 2 years, has this been radical shift from a Japanese perspective in recruiting, that the new graduates weren't looking for jobs for life, because Japan still had this job for life culture, and you get in and you work your way up, and that was just the way it was. So graduate recruiting was just being turned on its head already in career recruiting, because they just didn't know how to do this model where someone would join for 18 months and then leave. That wasn't how it was done for the previous 30 or 40 years. And when I dug into it, it seems to be, and this isn't a very scientific perspective, but it seems to be driven by social media, in that, being in Japan and driven by Japanese culture may have been something that was the dominant influence on your cultural aspects and relationships to work for decades, until the world became much smaller with the advent of social media. So if you now see yourself less as a person from Japan and more as a 20-year-old, your affinity is with other 20-year-olds in the world, and you see them behaving a certain way to their employment lifestyle. So why wouldn't you behave the same? I think that has those things. That's where technology comes into play, where that really influences people, where we didn't quite have that with, if you were from a generation with less technology, different technology.
Yes.
It wasn't, we were probably influenced more by, in Ireland, BBC and RTE, the TV networks, and maybe you're lucky a bit of the sitcoms in the US. And that drove our cultural references as Gen Xers. Whereas now it's YouTube. I know my kids, the Gen Z segment of my family, are driven much more by YouTubers, and the barriers over what network TV station you have in your home to influence you, that just doesn't exist anymore. It's much wider.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I take a point. I think it's sorry, and here
Yeah.
I'm talking when I'm meant to be interviewing you, Mary. But what are your observations like?
Yeah.
And you're working in academia
Yeah.
as well, so you work a
Yeah.
lot with students as well.
Yeah.
What are some of the things you think are particularly unique around they're probably classified as Gen Zs now,
Yeah.
graduates coming out of universities now? What have you observed are noticeable shifts between those individuals and previous generations?
Yeah, yeah. Great, Johnny. Well, I think that's a really important point around, the 21-year-old or the 20-year-old in Japan probably having more in common with the 20-year-old in New York than with their parents.
Yeah.
And we see that we're sort of in this borderless world now. So I think that's a really important point. And just to go, because I think there's a lot of confusion around the generations. I mean, if you're still talking about millennials, you really need to move on, because millennials at their oldest are 40. They're like in their late 30s, 40s. So we really need to focus on the centennials, or Generation Z, born 1995 onwards. So they're the youngest generation coming into our workplaces. And again, really interesting generation that do require a slightly different approach. And we know that they are the true digital natives. So these are the iPhone generation really coming in. What have we noticed, Johnny? Well, I think sadly, levels of depression, anxiety are higher than ever this generation. And one thing that's very striking is loneliness. And particularly for young women, there's a huge loneliness epidemic in the workplace that has been really amplified by the global pandemic. So we know this cohort are the loneliest reporting the highest levels of loneliness. And isn't it interesting? Never have we been more connected digitally, but yet people are feeling just this great disconnect. So, also levels of self-harm. So we have a lot of issues around mental health and resilience issues with the younger generations. Um, we also know that whole concept of, loyalty to an employer and the job for life piece, that really is no longer relevant. And if I were to sum it up, Johnny, I would say that the younger generations want access, not ownership.
Mm.
So what I mean by that, they want access to experiences. They want to do the backpacking around Asia. They're not that interested in getting a mortgage or getting the flash car. They're not that interested in getting tied into an organization. I remember in my doctoral research, a really bright young female engineer, and I talked to her about, a permanent pensionable job. I mean, she actually recoiled. She was like, oh, no, no, not interested at all. And with this in mind, I think we need to get a lot better at managing exits in a much more positive way. Um, and building that community of talent and looking at that boomerang employee. So I know a lot of the professional services firms who take in, the big cohorts of grads, they're really good at actually getting that boomerang employee back when they've done their stint abroad. And I think we just need to focus a lot more on that, and managing exits in a much more positive way.
It's funny you mentioned, I was on a call this morning with Kingsley Akins, who joined us last week on the show. And myself and Kingsley were talking about this, and he brought up the Reid Hoffman position, Reid Hoffman being the founder of LinkedIn, former CEO of LinkedIn. And he was saying back in the day, his approach to interviewing was he would interview potential candidates for the organization and ask them, how can we, if you take a job with us, help you find your next job, as in your next employer?
Yeah.
And he's been a big advocate in the last decade of this concept of, journeymen or journeywomen. And, this concept that people are coming into your organization for a time. How can you leverage that great time and their network and then help them move on and keep in touch with them and perhaps have them back? And that's a new enough concept, where retention is still such a focus, as opposed to how can you really develop a great relationship with that somebody, they can have a high impact, move on, maybe come back or influence others to come back to your business. By the way, quick shout out from Erin Dillard, who's listening, who's saying amen to your comment about stop talking about millennials. So you've got the support of our listeners in that one for sure, Mary.
Yeah.
I want to move the conversation, if you don't mind, on to the last year and the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because the Deloitte article we referenced earlier does go into this, and it talks about it, and you touched on it a little bit about, what we're seeing in the last year. The data I thought from this Deloitte article, just to come back to it for a second, was really fascinating, because it was counterintuitive with regard to how the different generations seem to have experienced the pandemic and its impact in work. And again, I don't want to generalize and say it's the same for everyone, but maybe would you mind summarizing what you got from the article around what it shared about the insights from the pandemic, particularly, and how it affects different generations?
Yes, so I think this article really correlates a lot of other initial emerging research we're seeing around the impact of the pandemic, Johnny. And we are seeing that the younger generations are struggling a lot more. They found it a lot more difficult to adapt to the new reality. Older workers reported higher levels of flexibility and adaptability in relation to the pandemic. And just to share a little story with you, I was speaking to a HR director of one of the big banks here in Dublin about a year ago now, and it was probably March, when we were all told you have to work from home. And she was telling me that they had to get the security guards to get the younger generations out of the building. So people in their
Wow.
early mid-20s, they really did not want to leave the office, because when you think about it, that's their social life. That's their, where they have their connection. They could be living in flat shares. Work is such a massive part of your life at that stage of your career as well. And I thought that was really, really interesting. Whereas some of us in different generations, I know people in my generation, particularly a lot of women, who've been crying out for years for flexibility, wanting to work from home more. And finally, they were getting that opportunity. So I think that was one thing that really struck me around the flexibility and the adaptability of the older generations. Yeah.
It's funny because you mentioned, the life stage alternative to the generational piece. And I really like that because
Yeah.
I was watching, and again, show my age. I was watching the Friends reunion last week. Did you watch the Friends reunion?
Yes.
Like how does he get the Friends reunion into a conversation about talent? Well, let me tell you how I get into conversation about talent. So I was watching that, and it struck me. There was a line from one of the actors in the show, and she or he said something along the lines of, "It's about that time, a decade typically of your life, when your friends are your family." And so
Yeah.
obviously your
Yeah.
first 20 years, your family are your family. Then
Yeah.
there's the next 10 years where your friends are your family. And then you maybe start your own family or partnership, or becomes maybe more about your family and siblings again. And it is a unique time. And I think that is probably the pattern. Okay, it correlates with age, of course it does.
Yeah.
But it is about what's going on in your life. And when your friends are your family, your work friends are a big part
Yeah.
of that. When you're maybe moved on from that part of your life, at whatever age it is, you don't perhaps rely on those individuals. And also from a networking position, you've built a strong network, you've made connections, so you can afford to probably take a year and a half off.
Yeah.
Whereas if you haven't, or you're only in the middle of doing that,
Yeah.
that's tough, Mary, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Johnny. And Professor Martin Seligman, who I'm sure many of your viewers will know, arguably the father of positive psychology, he puts it really nicely. He talks about the expansive stage in our lives, which is that exact stage you're talking about, when we have lots of, we're out in the world, perhaps starting our career, looking for a partner, in that travel, that expansive stage. And then as we move through life, we move to a more contracting stage. And Seligman's work from the pandemic research has shown that it's people in the expansive stage have suffered so much more
Mm,
than
mm.
those of us more in that contracting, where when we're a bit more settled with the mortgage and the family and whatever. Um, so yeah, I think it's been really tough. And I think there's as we move back into this post-pandemic workplace, I think leaders really are going to have to step up around supporting the connectedness of the younger workers.
So I want to maybe ask Niall, who's to bring in a graph that, if you don't mind, you maybe can
Oh
talk
yeah,
us
sure.
through. This is a framework that you'd advocate for engaging younger generations, what you call the
Yeah.
Motivate framework. I wonder if you could walk us through this at a high level, as a kind of tool that perhaps some of our listeners and viewers could use.
Yeah, great. So this was the output of my doctoral research of getting under the bonnet. And again, if anyone's interested, I have a really short article that I'd be very happy to share that goes through this in more detail. But the Motivate framework is really a synthesis of all of the key themes when I looked at the engineers, lawyers, and accountants in my study. And the first thing, what is really going to motivate and engage these younger generations? Meaning and purpose. Having a really doing meaningful work and having a real purpose coming to work each day. The second is opportunity and challenge. And that's around providing opportunity for feedback and challenging work. And that sense of I'm growing my skills here. Um, the T refers to timely, honest communication. And this is not your biannual performance appraisal. This has to be, really regular, really, feedback, feedback, feedback. If you're to take one message around younger generations, really getting a lot of feedback is so important. Then we have values, working for a values driven organization. We know millennials are the most socially conscious generation. And bearing in mind that by 2025, 75% of the global workforce will be millennials, 75%. We also need to really prepare for the centennials, as I said, and the centennials are in our workplaces right now. We've got graduates, we've got interns, we've got co-ops coming in. So being very much a values-driven organization. Energy management. Now that refers to working with, this is around really well-being and working with the energy flows of each person on the team. If someone wants to put their laptop on at 11 o'clock at night and work through till 3 a.m., if the role allows, that is what came through as a really important theme in my study. And then we have terms and conditions. So we know equality is very important, that people are treated fairly. And then that attentive management and investing in personal career path. And just to share with you, Johnny, there's the first study that was done on the centennials in the workplace. It showed what are the top 3 things they're looking for. And I thought this was fascinating. So number 1 is supportive leadership. Number 2 is positive relationships at work. And number 3 is flexibility.
Mm.
So it's all around that, I want to be in that almost paternalistic type of environment where my manager really has my back, is looking out for me, is supporting my development. I've got really good relationships in work, and I also have that sense of flexibility.
And I think the last year and a half has probably driven more of that. I hope it's opened up the opportunities, as you said, to certainly flexibility. The fact that we're all going through this massive crisis together hopefully has driven more empathy between managers and their teams, and that will last. But you would hope that this is perhaps, we're turning the page on a new chapter of how organizations lead and the relationship between not just the different generations, but anyone in the workplace, and how they're managed and how they're engaged in the business. Mary, I want to just jump for 1 second, if you don't mind, into the book. I know you poured your heart and soul into it. I know that you're, glad to get it done. And I won't ask you for your advice on anyone else looking to write a book, but yours is done. I want you maybe to, if you don't mind, to give me a little bit of a summary about the book. We'll remind people, and Nadia wouldn't mind bringing it back up on screen again. That's Recruiting Talented People by Mary Collins, which is available on Amazon, Chartered Accountants Ireland, or anywhere where you can find it on a good Google search, as we did earlier on today. But maybe could you tell me a little bit about, again, who is this aimed at and what does it do?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for, I still feel, you get that imposter syndrome when you see your name. I'm like, oh my God, is that really mine? This book, Johnny, I mean, my real wish with this book is that it is a very practical guide. So it is filled with templates, with best practice, with case studies. And it is aimed at SME leaders who, really just have been reactive. Okay, somebody's left, let's refill that role. And when I was approached about writing it a few years ago now, I really thought, gosh, is this something I want to give my time to? And I'm so glad I did, because we spend so much of our lives in work. And we know when we get that fit right, it can be transformational in our lives. But when we get it wrong, it really can be so detrimental to everyone involved. So this is a guide to help SME leaders really with the starting point around what is your employer brand? And just getting them to think about that. And then I'm really keen on the whole concept of talent grazing, when you're always looking for great people. And in one of your previous sessions, Johnny, you spoke about, I thought it was a brilliant, I think it was the Lego Eunice's shortlist, where you get the example of somebody, a receptionist being part of if he or she spotted somebody with a good attitude. So that concept of, you're constantly looking for good people, right through to how do workforce planning, like let's set your 5-year plan. Let's have a look at how you can do that resource planning. Through to, even if you don't have a significant budget, how can you make really good hiring decisions? What are some of the more creative ways around the hiring process? And really through to that onboarding piece, which we know is so critical, having, that first impressions really, really do last, right up to the 100-day plan. And there's guides there and templates to help. What sort of questions should you be asking somebody sort of first month in? So that's it. It's sort of the life cycle of the hiring process.
I love the theme, because for a lot of companies of that size, they don't necessarily have a team or even one person dedicated to recruiting and the ancillary areas. They mightn't have a HR person dedicated full time. And so largely the business owner or some of the senior managers, perhaps the manager of the biggest team, generally takes that on her shoulders. She's got to do all this stuff, but she's never been trained in this. She doesn't have a guidebook. And I guess it is a guidebook for those individuals. But I'd argue, I think over time, we're going to see perhaps other people who in larger companies also read this, as we see that, mixing of TA professional and hiring manager working together as a team. I think it's a good educational handbook for those individuals as well. So if you're working in a large organization and you're running a large team, I wouldn't say it's not for you. It may not have been written directly for you, but I think there's a huge amount that any leader in any organization could get from this to give them a real good overview of recruiting, onboarding, the important aspects of managing teams as well, and how it all connects together. Would that be a fair point?
Yes, I think so, Johnny. And there's some really good insights as well from thought leaders in the sector. And we do also cover off the multi-generational piece. How can you ensure that you're appealing to all generations in the hiring process?
So, Mary, we're at that point of the show where we ask our guest to leave us with one more piece of advice, because you've littered us with advice and tips and articles to read and authors to look up and people to research. And thank you so much for that. It's fantastic, Mary. And, there's obviously a wealth of knowledge, that goes into what you've produced here today and in the book as well. And I'm personally very excited to hopefully have you join the platform with some new courses we plan for later in the year for social talent users. So any social talent users listening, if you've enjoyed this, Mary's coming soon. But I was wondering if you could leave us with one last tip, one last piece of advice that either you have been given by somebody else through your career, or something that you now give to others from your experiences in your short career so far. I'll be nice and say that, Mary. But we're barely halfway.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of career left, isn't there, Johnny? The whole second half is there. Yeah, and I am going to say radical empathy. It's so interesting. Empathy levels have dropped by 40% in the last 20 years. Like, it's staggering, isn't it? 40% in the last 20 years. And, I spend a lot of my life in working with healthcare leaders and the undergrads. When medical students start, they have really high levels of empathy. And year on year, that empathy just goes off a cliff. And it's the same in most professions. So I think particularly coming out in this post-pandemic world, we really want to focus on building our empathy. And I'm calling it radical because it needs to be radical. And I like to think of empathy as a muscle. We know you can develop empathy with focused, consistent effort. And the best way to develop empathy is to really work on your listening skills. So my invitation to everyone today is the next time you have a conversation, if it's with your 3-year-old or your 90-year-old grandmother, the next time you're having a conversation, put the technology away and really give your full time, attention and presence to that person. And I think we've got really, really poor at listening. So let's try and develop that empathy muscle. And especially in the workplace, I want, with the younger generations experiencing so much anxiety, depression, stress, that we do show empathy to everyone in the workplace. But I think particularly people in this coming back to the new world of work, people who've really struggled, that we do show that empathy. And finally, Johnny, I'm going to say empathy for ourselves, because it's been really, we have all been living through, this is like the crisis of our generation for all of us. And, all leadership does start with self-leadership. So I'd encourage people to show empathy to themselves as well. And that self-care piece is so important.
Thank you so much for that, Marion. Two things from that. One is, I always wondered what would we call the generation after Generation Z, and I'm worried they might be called Generation COVID, because that might be the defining thing for them. But your point on listening is fantastic as a driver of empathy. It's something that we came up with in our business last week. One of my colleagues was asking me about an article I shared many years ago. I dug it out on listening, and one of the top tips, or the leading tip it led with, was around listening. It was saying that people think listening is all about not saying anything, but actually one of the top things in listening is making sure that you follow up after you listen with follow-up questions. And that's a way to demonstrate that you have heard the person. So deep listening is not just about shutting up. It's about truly listening, and then your follow-up questions will demonstrate the fact that you have heard the person and you're involved. So I think it's great advice. Now is the time for listening, Mary. Really, it's been a pleasure. It's flown by. We're going to have you on again. You don't really have a choice, Mary. So we'll get you on, because there's tons more topics I know that we've already chatted in person about, and I'm dying to get back for a cup of coffee, cup of tea in person, maybe a wheat cake and beauties in Grafton Street. So let's hope that's soon, Mary. But it's been a pleasure to have you on Show 53. I will chat to you again soon.
Thank you so much to Johnny and the Social Talent team. And thanks to everyone for listening. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Thank you for listening. We're going to be back again next week for episode 54, as hopefully the long, hot summer continues. So next week, which is Wednesday, 9th of June, we'll broadcast live at 4 p.m. Irish UK time. That's going to be 11 a.m. in the East Coast of the US and 8 a.m. the West Coast, on solving the skills shortage with military hiring. So I'm really excited to have Karen Childress-Wiley. She's Executive Director of the Veteran Center of Excellence at Randstad Technologies. And Karen is the daughter of a vet and someone who's really passionate about military hiring, and has worked with thousands of recruiters and leaders in a role at Randstad, formerly at Monster, to basically help really kind of raise the prominence of veterans and really kind of educate the world on the power of veterans and how their skills can be really utilized across the organization, and also work with recruiters and leaders to basically understand how they can bring veterans into their team and really harness that wider inclusivity and diversity that's available. So really dying to hear Karen's updates on what's happening in the world of military hiring, obviously mainly from a US perspective and her own experience, but something that I think applies everywhere in the world. So do join us next week for Show 54 on that. You can find out more about our show, and you can subscribe to the show updates, and also find links to our podcast, live shows, and back catalogue at socialtalent.com/the shortlist. But until then, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.